So this is our last topic of the semester. Unfortunately, I have to record this with a voice that's kind of giving out. So I apologize for that. This is my substitute for being able to do it in person. This is a nice topic to finish things up, kind of looks forward to what people might be planning to do in the future with plants using new technology and really opening up with a whole lot of opportunities and a little controversy, as we'll see. So engineering, as in genetic engineering. So a little bit of a branch out from what we talked about with domestication in the last topic. So lots of concerns these days with global agriculture. There's only so much land in the world that people can cultivate. And there are a lot of people on the planet. So there are getting to be more and more people every year. And overpopulation, or at least larger populations in some parts of the world, are putting a strain on the land's ability to support people. So in some places, people are looking for new options for breeding or otherwise manipulating plants to produce what they need to survive in those areas. So it's kind of a takeoff, a branch away from what we talked about last time with conventional breeding. And as we talked before, a couple of limitations for the conventional breeding of plants is that you're working with natural variation. So you can modify an organism pretty far, but you have to work with what is given to you by nature. So you have to work with limits and sizes of fruits, or simply the kinds of structures that a given species can produce. There's only so far you can modify that with natural variation. And so it's possible to actually branch out from that and get even more variation or total new kinds of genetics if you can extend beyond the traditional species boundaries. So speaking of species boundaries, breeding, if you want to breed plants and create hybrids or whatever you're doing with your conventional breeding, you've got to work with plants that are genetically compatible. So you have to be able to cross one species with another species. Sometimes they're compatible, but in many cases, one species can't be crossed with another. So as much as you might love the attributes of a tomato and an eggplant, the genetic barriers to those species, they're different enough species that you wouldn't be able to cross them with each other in a natural setting and get some kind of hybrid tomato eggplant fruit, or take advantage of the genetic variation, the differences in the genetic abilities of those different plants. So there's a lot of variation in the world, even within a genus. As I've shown an example here from the genus called Solanum that has quite a few crop plants in it. You're still kind of limited that not all of these plants can actually successfully cross with one another. So that gets you into the opportunity to employ new technology in what we call genetic engineering. So some people want to kind of mince words and talk about the kind of debate the definition of genetic engineering. And I'll just say that it's most commonly used to refer to when you take the genetic information from one organism and move that into another completely different organism. So from one plant into another plant, or as we'll see some more extreme examples, you can take genes from bacteria and put them into plants where they can be useful. So this involves something in the laboratory, manipulation of DNA, and not exactly, this is kind of one of the stock photos that you often find of genetic engineering where someone is doing lab work out in the field or something like that. This is not typically something you would see too much. Maybe this person is concerned about pesticides on this crop, I don't know. But mostly this genetic engineering would be taking place in the laboratory, and then only after those plants are established would they be planted out in the field somewhere. So kind of a fanciful example here, but you could take it to some pretty far extremes and say, okay, well, what do you want from a trait from any organism anywhere in the world that you would put into a plant? And in some ways you can dream it up and it could be true. So what we'll talk about, a lot of these modifications are small metabolic modifications, one enzyme at a time, or a few at a time, to get the change that you're looking for. So maybe not something quite so extreme as walking plants or anything like that, but maybe someday. So lots of opportunities for what you could change about a plant. And these are all active areas of research. So trying to find plants that are better suited to their environment, or maybe more suited than anything that's naturally available right now. Potentially tackling things like drought tolerance, flooding tolerance, nutrient deficiencies, salt tolerance, things like that. If you can get at a molecular reason for plants to suffer from salt or heat or something like that, and try to overcome that, this is an opportunity for you to maybe manipulate the genetic elements that are responsible. So we don't get into too many of the specifics about this process, but basically involves locating the genes responsible for the effect, whether it's the genes that cause a vulnerability or the genes that cause a solution to a problem, and then trying to move those around in between organisms, or modify them in the existing organism. So this one's very common, the differences in climate. This would potentially open up new areas of the world that could be used for cropland. And then other modifications such as enhancing photosynthesis. This one was an interesting study where they're taking a photosynthetic bacterium and they mutated it and exposed it to really high levels of light. So these areas, they got the relatively benign levels of light up here, and then increased to bigger and bigger solar radiation. And the mutated versions are adapted to employ these pigmentation defenses, I suppose, to get them past the challenges of extra sunlight. So, potentially growing plants in places where they can't typically grow. This is one of the strategies you could use to kind of find a genetic solution for that. This is an illustration of one of the biggest kind of poster examples of genetic modification. It's a modification called golden rice. And as you're familiar, rice in its natural form is basically white. And white rice, while it has lots of energy content in starch and carbohydrates, it doesn't have a lot of nutrient content. So as we talked in global diets, a lot of people around the world consume grains, but a lot of those grains are only a part of the diet. They can't really fill in for some of these more important or essential vitamins that need to be provided. So some scientists tried this opportunity to modify the enzymes present in a rice plant. And they actually borrowed a couple, as you can see, from other organisms. So over here in this metabolic pathway, converting this molecule through a few steps into beta carotene. They actually borrowed molecules from daffodil and a soil bacterium. And they're able to basically genetically modify this rice plant to make itself yellow. And that's an indicator of the presence of the beta carotene, which is a vitamin for people. So one opportunity to add on a vitamin supplement in the foods that people might already be eating. So if you are cultivating this golden rice, then you've got the traditional benefits of rice, but also an added benefit of the vitamins that come with it. So potentially a nice opportunity there for people who might not have that vitamin A in their diet quite as well. Big topic that has this is more economic importance in our country. This ability to get plants to defend themselves against weeds. And I'll show you the example of kind of one of the more high profile examples of genetic modification for weed defense. And it's a two-parter. So the first part is that there's this herbicide called glyphosate, which is an inhibitor of a process, and basically it inhibits a common process in plants that is important for producing over here these amino acids. And so in the presence of glyphosate or brand name Roundup, this process is inhibited and those amino acids can't be made, and that kills the plants. And so it's, as it says here, the broad spectrum herbicide. This kills all kinds of plants when you apply glyphosate to them. And the genetic engineering component of this is that scientists developed this, what they call Roundup Ready option, where they substitute the natural enzyme for an enzyme that's different, but does the same process. So the enzyme is not susceptible to glyphosate, but it still gets this job done. And they did that by borrowing the enzyme from bacteria. So then if they teach their kinds of plants to survive glyphosate, then they can apply glyphosate in everything except for that genetically modified plant should die as a result of that. So this was a major step forward in kind of an efficiency of taking care of the weeds on your croplands. Another problem for crops is herbivores. This is a strategy known as BT, which is an abbreviation for the Bacillus thuringiensis bacterium, which makes a toxin, so BT toxin. And they basically taught the crops that have this modification, they taught them to make the toxin so that the crops themselves have a new way to be toxic to the pests that try to eat them. So just an illustration here of this caterpillar chewing on a corn plant, bop, 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 and dead caterpillar. And of course, these strategies, they've been very popular and they've saved people a lot of money. And in a lot of ways, they've come across looking like a really slam dunk, easy solution to an age-old problem, right? We have weeds and pests are some of the things that farmers would spend a lot of money on. And through these genetic modifications, this allows them to get rid of those problems and maybe save some money in the long term. But of course, you probably heard there's a lot of controversy about genetic modification. So I've got here GMOs. I imagine you're familiar with this abbreviation, but GMO is genetically modified organism. And that's another one people sometimes debate the definition of. And I'm just going to stick with what we talked about before of genetically engineered. So genetically modified, in a more strict definition of having an artificial genetic component from some other organism or artificial manipulation in the laboratory of the natural genetic elements in a plant. So start off with some positive effects. So positive effects are that as a result of getting these genetically modified crops, the output is greater. So we have crops that can produce more, means that you can grow more crops on smaller footprints of land, requiring less resources. So it's a money saver for the farmer, but also maybe a saver for the environment as well. Being able to grow these crops more densely together means that they can again have more output for a smaller amount of space, also require less space for weed control if the weeds are automatically being controlled. So this has been one of the reasons that our corn crops around us grow so close together these days. Just together, all of these things are adding up to a more efficient way to grow crops. So if you're growing one species and you can keep growing that same species without competition from weeds, without pressure from herbivores, then you can save a lot of money, save a lot of resources. So there are some upshots to this for sure. I think people often hear, I think the more vocal support we often hear is from the sides that are saying this is all a bad idea, but there's some reasons to maybe support it. The negative effects, of course, have to be some. One of the negative effects is that over time, presenting natural elements like weeds and herbivores, if you present them with a challenge like a plant that's resistant to them, uh, evolution is really good at getting around that. So weeds can find their way around these herbicide problems. The herbivores can find a way around those Bt toxins and other solutions. And so you're in some ways maybe just kicking the can down the road for a problem you'll have to solve later. This is pretty impressive number of species just basically since the introduction of this glyphosate program and Roundup Ready. In the time since then, there's just been species after species have shown examples of them becoming resistant. And now if you're a resistant weed and you're the only weed that can survive on one of these glyphosate sprayed fields, that's a big selection gradient for becoming a dominant weed wherever those plants are grown. So it looks like we'll have to keep solving with new solutions for these new resistant weeds. So I think initially there was a lot of pushback against GMOs, a lot of concern. Not too long ago, the scientists kind of came around and said, well, we're scientists and we support this idea. Not to say that scientists are completely impartial. Obviously, a lot of scientists are doing research. They're paid to do research and might have a vested interest in new scientific solutions. But they're kind of a voice of reason, maybe at the same time for the advantages. So with all these things, decide for yourself, get informed, but it's not quite as black and white, I think, as it's sometimes presented. And if you weigh things like the cost, the toll on the environment, the human element of people potentially going hungry in the world, these are things that have to get away all the different considerations when you think about whether you're supporting something like this. A little bit, maybe a fresher direction that's been coming up recently is to take a kind of a targeted approach to traditional breeding. So one of the problems with the crops we have now, we have these corn crops and all the plants that we have now have been modified to a specific endpoint that has very low genetic variation. And so there's this push to kind of integrate natural genetic variation from kind of the same species or similar species. So it's bringing in specific genetic elements, but through more of a targeted breeding approach and less of a genetic modification approach. And the idea is basically that, as we've talked, the wild versions of plants are a little bit more resilient against pests, against climate changes, stresses and drought and things. And so the goal is kind of to bring in the genetic elements that make them more resilient and put those into our crop plants. So you could potentially have very similar to what we have today as crops, but now able to grow in different places than they could grow today. And however you want to do it, there's lots of opportunities moving forward, lots of science, scientists exploring new ways to modify plants to become something that, in their mind makes the world a better place. And it's a lot of opportunity.